Tony Soprano, the fictional New Jersey mob boss portrayed brilliantly by James Gandolfini in HBO's groundbreaking series The Sopranos, represents one of television's most complex examinations of organized crime economics. Over 6 seasons, spanning 1999 to 2007, viewers witnessed not just the psychological unraveling of a crime boss, but also the intricate financial machinery of a modern American mafia family. This analysis examines Tony's various revenue streams, his business tactics, and attempts to calculate his approximate earnings throughout the series. Before diving into Tony's personal earnings, it's essential to understand the organizational structure he operated within. Tony Soprano served as the de facto boss of the daimyo crime family, though officially he was the acting boss while Jackie April Sr. and later his uncle Jr. held the titular position. This arrangement had both political and financial implications. In the traditional mob hierarchy, money flows upward. Soldiers kick up to capos, capos kick up to the underboss and consigliere, and ultimately everything funnels to the boss. Tony's position at the top of this pyramid meant he received tribute from every revenue-generating operation in his organization, typically taking 15 to 20% of his captain's earnings before they distributed money to their crews. The most legitimate appearing of Tony's operations was waste management, primarily represented by Barone Sanitation. The garbage industry has historically been a mafia stronghold in the New York and New Jersey area, and for good reason. It's a cash-intensive business with regular, predictable revenue streams and numerous opportunities for fraud, bid rigging, and union control. Tony's waste management operations worked on multiple levels. First, there was the legitimate business of actually collecting garbage from commercial and residential customers. Barone Sanitation likely generated somewhere between $2 to $5 million annually in legitimate revenue. However, the real money came from the illegal aspects. The family controlled waste management contracts through bid rigging, ensuring that mob-connected companies won municipal contracts at inflated prices. They would coordinate with other mob families to divide territories and prevent competitive bidding. This could add 30 to 50% to the cost of contracts, with much of that premium flowing directly to Tony and his associates. Additionally, the garbage business provided perfect cover for illegal dumping. Rather than paying proper disposal fees for hazardous materials, mob-connected haulers would dump waste illegally, pocketing the difference. A single truck could save thousands of dollars per load through illegal dumping. With multiple trucks operating daily, this could generate an additional $1 million or more annually. Conservative estimate from Waste Management annually, $3 to $5 million in Tony's pocket after all kickbacks and expenses. Throughout the series, we see Tony connected to various legitimate businesses: Satrial's pork store, the Beta Bing strip club, a telecommunications company, a waterfront property development, and various restaurants and retail establishments. These businesses served multiple purposes in Tony's empire. First, they provided legitimate income that could be reported to the IRS. Tony needed reportable income to justify his lifestyle and avoid the fate of Al Capone, who went to prison for tax evasion rather than his numerous violent crimes. These businesses probably generated a combined legitimate income of $200,000 to $400,000 annually that Tony could report. Second, these businesses served as vehicles for money laundering. Cash from illegal operations, gambling, loan sharking, stolen goods would be run through these businesses, emerging as apparently legitimate income. The Bada Bing was particularly useful for this purpose. Strip clubs are cash-intensive businesses where it's difficult to verify actual customer counts or spending. Tony could claim that a Tuesday night generated $10,000 in revenue when it actually generated $3,000, with the extra $7,000 being drug money or gambling proceeds. The HUD scam Tony participated in with Assemblyman Zellman and Maurice Tiffin demonstrated another aspect of his legitimate business operations. By defrauding government housing programs, they were able to generate substantial income while maintaining a veneer of legitimacy. This single scam likely netted Tony several $100,000. Conservative estimate from legitimate businesses and money laundering operations annually, $1 to $2 million. Gambling represents one of the most significant revenue streams for any mob family, and the Sopranos were no exception. Tony's organization ran various gambling operations, including sports betting, high-stakes card games, and a sports book. The famous executive game that appeared several times throughout the series represented the highest stakes gambling operation under Tony's control. In one episode, we see Dr. Stu, a degenerate gambler, lose $45,000 in a single night. The house typically takes a percentage of every pot in card games, usually around 5 to 10%. In a high-stakes game running once or twice a week, this could generate $50,000 to $100,000 monthly just from the rake. Sports betting was even more lucrative. Tony's organization took bets on football, basketball, baseball, and other sports. The bookmaking operation worked on the vigorish or VIG. The commission charged on bets. Typically, bettors must wager $110 to win $100, with the extra $10 representing the bookmaker's commission. With balanced action on both sides of a bet, the bookmaker is guaranteed profit. During football season, Tony's organization likely handled hundreds of thousands of dollars in bets weekly. Even with a relatively modest handle of $500,000 per week during football season, the VIG alone would generate $25,000 to $35,000 weekly, or over $400,000 during a typical NFL season. Add in year-round basketball betting, baseball season, and other sports, and the annual take from the VIG could easily exceed $1 million. Additionally, when bettors lost and couldn't pay, they often became sources of additional revenue through loan sharking, discussed below, or by being forced to provide services or information valuable to the organization. Conservative estimate from gambling operations annually, $2 to $3 million. Loan sharking, lending money at usurious interest rates, is one of the most profitable and pernicious mob operations, and it was a specialty of Tony's organization. We see numerous examples throughout the series. Davey Scatino, the sporting goods store owner who borrows from Tony and is destroyed financially. Hesh Lobel, who runs a large lending operation and kicks up to Tony, and countless others. The interest rates charged by mob loan sharks typically range from 1 to 5% per week, compounding. This means a $10,000 loan at 2% weekly interest, known as 2 points, would require a $200 weekly payment just to cover interest, with the principal never decreasing unless additional payments were made. Annually, this represents a 104% interest rate, and with compounding, the effective rate is even higher. The genius of loan sharking from a criminal's perspective is that the principal is never meant to be repaid. The goal is to keep the borrower paying interest indefinitely. When borrowers can't pay, their assets can be seized, their businesses taken over, or they can be forced to commit crimes or provide services for the organization. Hesh alone was shown to have millions of dollars on the street. If we conservatively estimate that Tony's organization, including Hesh's operation, from which Tony took a percentage, had $5 million loaned out at an average of 2 points per week, the weekly interest income would be $100,000 or over $5 million annually. Of course, not all of this would be collected. Some borrowers default, some pay late, some die, but even collecting 50% would represent $2.5 million in annual revenue. Tony also personally engaged in loan sharking, including a particularly memorable storyline where he lends money to Hesh and then cruelly delays repayment, psychologically tormenting his old friend. This demonstrated both the casual cruelty of the business and Tony's personal involvement in this revenue stream. Conservative estimate from loan sharking operations annually, $2 to $4 million. The romantic image of mobsters hijacking trucks full of merchandise has basis in reality, and Tony's crew regularly engaged in various forms of theft. Christopher Moltisanti and Brendan Filoni's hijacking of Comley Trucking's shipments in the first season demonstrated this operation, though their sloppiness in hitting the same company repeatedly showed the risks involved. Stolen goods operations worked on a simple premise: steal merchandise and sell it for a fraction of retail value, still making substantial profit since there was no cost of goods. A truck full of Italian suits worth $100,000 retail might be sold to fences for $20,000, representing pure profit minus the cost of the theft itself, paying the crew, bribing any insiders, etc. Throughout the series, we see stolen goods ranging from wine, the famous Vesuvio plot, where Tony and his crew rob a shipment of expensive Italian wine, to tools, electronics, cigarettes, and more. Cigarette smuggling was particularly profitable due to the varying tax rates between states. Cigarettes purchased in low-tax states and sold in high-tax states could be marked up substantially while still undercutting legitimate prices. The organization likely pulled off several significant scores annually, plus numerous smaller thefts. A conservative estimate might be one major score monthly, $50,000 to $100,000, and numerous smaller operations, generating perhaps $1 to $2 million annually, of which Tony would take his boss's cut of 15 to 20%. Conservative estimate from theft operations annually, $500,000 to $1 million. One of the most lucrative and least violent of mob operations involves controlling construction unions and manipulating the construction industry. Tony's organization had connections to several unions, including the Esplanade construction project that featured prominently in the fourth season. The construction rackets work through several mechanisms. First, through union control, the mob can demand no-show jobs, positions where workers are paid but don't actually work, with the paychecks going to mob associates. Second, they can extort contractors by threatening labor problems, work stoppages, or violence unless tribute is paid. Third, they can rig bids for subcontracting work, ensuring mob-connected companies win contracts at inflated prices. Fourth, they can sell labor peace to legitimate contractors who prefer to pay a premium rather than deal with strikes or slowdowns. The Esplanade project was estimated to be worth many millions of dollars. Ralph Cifaretto, as construction captain, would have extracted perhaps 5 to 10% of the project's value in various kickbacks and schemes, conservatively $2 to $5 million over the project's lifetime. As boss, Tony would have received a substantial portion of this, perhaps $500,000 to $1 million just from this single project. Beyond the Esplanade, Tony's organization controlled or influenced several unions and had ongoing construction rackets. These operations likely generated steady income year-round, particularly during good economic times when construction was booming. Conservative estimate from construction and union operations annually, $1 to $2 million. The classic mob racket of protection, demanding payments from businesses in exchange for not being harmed, was alive and well in Tony's New Jersey. While the series didn't focus heavily on this aspect, it was present in various forms throughout. Paulie Walnuts was shown collecting regular payments from various businesses in his territory. Tony mentions putting the arm on people. Junior Soprano complained about the low returns from his protection rackets after Tony effectively sidelined him as boss. These payments were typically modest per business, perhaps a few hundred to a few $1,000s monthly, but with dozens or hundreds of businesses paying, they added up to significant revenue. The beauty of protection money, from a criminal's perspective, is that it's recurring revenue requiring minimal effort once established. A weekly or monthly visit to collect cash from businesses in the territory could generate $10,000 to $20,000 weekly with very little overhead. Conservative estimate from extortion operations annually, $500,000 to $1 million. One of the series' running themes was Tony's public prohibition against drug dealing while privately profiting from it. Tony claimed to forbid his family from dealing drugs, maintaining this was a principle inherited from the old-time mobsters who viewed drug dealing as dishonorable and likely to bring severe federal prosecution. However, the reality was more complex. While Tony did discourage open drug dealing by his captains and soldiers, he was willing to overlook it in exchange for higher tribute, and he indirectly profited from drug operations through several mechanisms. Christopher's brief involvement with drug dealers, various associates who dealt drugs while paying Tony tribute, and Tony's willingness to look the other way when it suited him all contributed to drug-related revenue. Additionally, some of Tony's loan sharking customers were drug dealers who needed capital for their operations. Drug dealing is enormously profitable. Even a modest street-level operation can generate tens of thousands of dollars monthly. While Tony wasn't running a drug empire like some of his contemporaries in fiction, such as the Barksdale organization in The Wire, the drug money that flowed to him indirectly through increased tribute and associated operations likely added hundreds of thousands annually to his income. Conservative estimate from drug-related revenue annually, $300,000 to $800,000. Strategic assets / one-time scores, $1 million. Total gross annual revenue, approximately $16 million. Less business expenses of approximately $3 million. Net annual income, approximately $13 million. This is a conservative estimate for a good year. Some years would be better. The Esplanade project year, for instance. Some worse. Years with significant legal troubles or wars with other families. Understanding how much Tony made is incomplete without examining how he made it. Tony's business tactics revealed much about his character and the evolution of modern organized crime. Unlike older mob bosses who might have specialized in one or two rackets, Tony maintained a diverse portfolio of criminal enterprises. This diversification served multiple purposes. It provided stability when one revenue stream faced problems, it reduced dependence on any single operation that might be targeted by law enforcement, and it created multiple opportunities for growth. When the garbage business faced increased scrutiny, gambling revenue continued. When gambling debts went uncollected, Construction kickbacks filled the gap. This business school approach to criminal enterprise reflected the modern mafia's evolution. Tony understood that the most successful criminals operate with political protection. His relationships with Assemblyman Zellman, various judges, police officials, and building inspectors provided both advance warning of investigations and active protection from prosecution. These relationships required constant maintenance through campaign contributions, legal and illegal, personal favors, and shared criminal enterprises. The HUD scam couldn't have worked without Zellman's participation. Other operations required building inspectors to look the other way or police to ignore certain activities. Tony invested heavily in these relationships, understanding that the return on investment was substantial. A $50,000 contribution to a corrupt politician might generate millions in protected revenue over years. While Tony was certainly capable of explosive violence, his most effective uses of violence were strategic and calculated. He understood that violence was expensive, in legal costs if caught, in starting wars with other families, in creating law enforcement heat, and should be employed judiciously. When Tony ordered a hit, it was typically for clear business reasons, removing an informant, preventing testimony, eliminating a rival, or enforcing organizational discipline. Unnecessary violence that might draw attention or destabilize profitable operations was avoided when possible. This stood in contrast to some of his more volatile captains, like Ralph Cifaretto or Richie Aprile, whose emotional and erratic violence created problems for the organization. Unlike some bosses who remained completely insulated from criminal activity, Tony personally involved himself in the most lucrative operations. He attended the executive card game, personally collected from major debtors, and directly participated in significant scores. This hands-on approach served several purposes. It allowed Tony to ensure operations ran smoothly and money wasn't being skimmed from him. It maintained his reputation as a boss who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, earning respect from his crew, and it allowed him to maintain direct relationships with major earners and debtors, giving him leverage and information. However, this approach also exposed Tony to greater legal risk, as his personal involvement made him vulnerable to prosecution. This tension between effective management and legal safety was a constant theme in the series. Tony understood that the most effective criminal enterprises often hide behind legitimate business structures. Rather than operating as an obviously criminal organization, many of his operations used actual corporations, partnerships, and business entities. Barone Sanitation was a real company with real employees and legitimate contracts. The Bada Bing was a licensed business paying taxes, on some of its income at least. This structure provided legal protection, tax advantages, and respectability while facilitating criminal activity. The use of no-show jobs demonstrated this perfectly. Instead of simply giving money to associates, Tony put them on the payroll of legitimate businesses. This created reportable income for the associates, reducing their tax evasion risk, provided a cover story for their lifestyle, and allowed business deductions for what was essentially tribute. Tony was paranoid about surveillance, informants, and information security, with good reason. Law enforcement's primary tool against organized crime is turning members into informants or using electronic surveillance. Tony regularly swept his home for bugs, was careful about what he said on phones, conducted sensitive conversations in moving cars or outdoors where surveillance was difficult, and maintained strict information compartmentalization. Members of his crew often didn't know details of operations outside their direct involvement. When Tony suspected someone of being an informant, he moved decisively. Big Pussy's murder, while emotionally devastating to Tony, was necessary from a business perspective to prevent testimony. The discovery that Adriana was cooperating with the FBI led to her immediate execution. This obsession with security, while essential, also created a paranoid atmosphere that damaged relationships and made operations more difficult. Tony's suspicion of Carlo Gervasi in the final season, his deteriorating relationship with Paulie, and his growing isolation all stemmed partly from information security concerns. The word family in organized crime has dual meaning: the crime family and the literal family. Tony had to manage both, and the interaction between them significantly impacted his business operations. Tony used family businesses, Satrials, various restaurants, to create legitimate employment for family members and close associates. He brought Christopher into the organization despite Christopher's drug problems and instability because of their family connection. He tried, unsuccessfully, to keep AJ out of the life while using Meadows' intelligence for the organization's benefit. She unwittingly provided useful information about the FBI. His relationship with Uncle Junior was particularly complex from a business perspective. By allowing Junior to think he was boss while Tony actually ran things, Tony avoided a potentially destructive war and kept money flowing to Junior, maintaining peace and family loyalty. However, this arrangement also created the circumstances for Junior to attempt to have Tony killed, leading to one of the series' most dramatic moments. Managing literal family was expensive and complicated. Tony's extramarital affairs cost him money, gifts, apartments, support. His family's lifestyle, the large house, private schools, therapy bills, was expensive. The constant need to keep family separate from business while also protecting them from his enemies required significant resources. Throughout the series, Tony worked to expand his territory and consolidate power. The consolidation of Junior's crew under Tony's control, the absorption of Richie April's operations, and the eventual control of most North Jersey rackets represented a consistent strategy of growth. However, expansion brought Tony into conflict with the New York families, particularly through disputes over the Esplanade project and various territorial disagreements. Managing these conflicts required diplomatic skill, strategic marriages, including literal marriages between families, and occasionally violence. Tony's expansion was limited by the strength of the New York families. Unlike a Vito Corleone, who could become the most powerful boss in New York, Tony was always a mid-tier boss of a smaller family, forced to pay tribute to and negotiate with more powerful organizations. This limitation frustrated Tony, but also reflected the realistic balance of power in modern organized crime. The FBI's increasing effectiveness against organized crime required constant adaptation. The RICO statute, Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, allowed prosecution of entire organizations, making traditional mob structures vulnerable. Tony adapted by creating more distance between himself and street-level crimes, using cell phones carefully, avoiding creating documentary evidence, and using legitimate businesses to obscure criminal proceeds. The shift toward white-collar crimes like stock fraud reflected the reality that these crimes were harder to prosecute and carried lighter sentences than violent crimes. However, Tony's adaptation was imperfect. His temper led him to create evidence against himself. The murder of Ralph Cifaretto, for instance. His need to maintain respect and control sometimes overrode careful business practices. By the final season, the FBI was closing in, with several informants in his organization and extensive surveillance operations. Beyond physical violence, Tony was a master of psychological intimidation. His imposing physical presence, reputation for violence, and willingness to humiliate people publicly created an atmosphere of fear that made operations more efficient. When Tony wanted to collect a debt, his mere appearance often convinced debtors to find money they claimed not to have. When he wanted to take over a business, the owner often surrendered rather than face Tony's wrath. This psychological dominance reduced the need for actual violence in many situations. However, this approach also created resentments and enemies. People humiliated by Tony sometimes sought revenge or cooperated with authorities. The psychological toll on Tony himself was enormous, contributing to his panic attacks and depression. The decline, financial pressures in later seasons. While Tony's peak earning years were substantial, the later seasons of the show depicted increasing financial pressures. Pressure 1. War with New York. The conflict with the Lupertazzi family in seasons 5 and 6 created enormous expenses. The need for additional security, the loss of income from disrupted operations, the cost of going to war footing, and the eventual need to pay tribute to end the conflict all reduced Tony's net income substantially. Wars are expensive for criminal organizations. Lost revenue from disrupted operations, combined with increased costs for weapons, safe houses, and additional muscle, can drain treasuries quickly. Additionally, the heightened law enforcement attention that comes with mob warfare increases legal costs and the risk of prosecution. Pressure 2. Informants and legal costs. As more members of Tony's organization became informants or faced prosecution, legal costs skyrocketed. Junior's trial alone probably cost hundreds of thousands in legal fees. Christopher's various legal issues, the investigation into the Esplanade project, and Tony's own legal problems all required expensive attorneys. Additionally, supporting the families of incarcerated members was expected but expensive. When a soldier went to prison, the organization was obligated to support his family, potentially for years or decades. Pressure 3. Diminishing returns from traditional rackets. Several of Tony's traditional revenue sources faced diminishing returns as the series progressed. Increased law enforcement attention on the garbage industry, competition from legitimate businesses in various sectors, and the general decline of organized crime's power all reduced income from traditional sources. The younger generation of earners was less effective than previous generations. Christopher's drug addiction made him unreliable. Ajay's incompetence made him useless for organizational purposes. The quality of available recruits was declining as young Italian Americans had more legitimate opportunities. Pressure 4. Personal spending and lifestyle. Inflation. Tony's lifestyle became increasingly expensive as the series progressed. His gambling problem worsened, leading to substantial losses. His affairs became more expensive, maintaining mistresses in apartments, lavish gifts, etc. His legitimate lifestyle expenses grew as he tried to maintain the appearance of success. Additionally, Tony's therapy with Dr. Melfi, while beneficial psychologically, was expensive and created a paper trail documenting his regular schedule and movements. Final calculation: Tony's earnings. Throughout the series, The Sopranos, spanned approximately 8 years in the show's timeline, 1998 to 2007, though some accounts place it as slightly shorter, 1999 to 2007. For calculation purposes, we'll use 7 full years of operations at peak earning capacity, acknowledging that the final year was truncated and disrupted by war with New York. Years 1 to 4, peak earning period. These years represented Tony's strongest earning period. He had consolidated power after Jackie April's death, defeated or absorbed rivals like Richie April and Ralph Cifaretto, and was running multiple lucrative operations with minimal interference. Annual net income averaged $13 million. Total for 4 years, $52 million. Years 5 to 6, pressure period. These years saw increased pressure from law enforcement, the war with New York, and various disruptions to normal operations. Net income was substantially reduced. Annual net income averaged $8 million. Total for 2 years, $16 million. Year 7, final year, partial. The final season showed Tony under enormous pressure. The war with New York, multiple informants, FBI pressure, and operational disruptions severely impacted earnings. We'll estimate this as half a year at reduced capacity. Income for partial year, $3 million. Total net income over series run, approximately $71 million. However, from this, we must subtract extraordinary expenses that weren't part of normal operations. War with New York, security, tribute, lost revenue, minus $2 million. Legal defense costs over series run, minus $3 million. Settlement with Uncle Junior's crew, minus $1 million. One-time losses and expenses, minus $2 million. Adjusted. Total net income, approximately $63 million. This represents Tony's total take-home over the roughly 7-year run of the series. However, several factors complicate this calculation. Assets versus income. Some of this income was actually asset accumulation, property, business equity, etc. Tony's actual spendable cash was somewhat less, perhaps $45 to $50 million. Hidden assets. Tony likely had hidden assets not reflected in this calculation: offshore accounts, property in others' names, hidden cash. Sophisticated criminals often have 20 to 30% more wealth than visible calculations suggest. Debts and obligations. Tony owed money to various parties, had ongoing obligations, and faced potential legal judgments. These reduce actual net worth. The final scene. Ambiguity. If Tony was killed in the final scene, a popular interpretation, any assets he couldn't access immediately were lost to his family unless carefully estate planned. Given the FBI's interest in his finances, much of his wealth might be seized. Conclusion. The business of being Tony Soprano. Tony Soprano represented a particular moment in American organized crime history, the transition from old-school mob bosses to modern criminal CEOs, operating in an increasingly hostile legal and competitive environment. His earning power was substantial, likely accumulating somewhere between $60 to $70 million over 7 years, but so were the costs, risks, and pressures. What's striking about Tony's financial operations is how much they resembled legitimate business, albeit with violence as an enforcement mechanism. He diversified revenue streams, managed personnel, cultivated political relationships, adapted to competitive pressures, and attempted to balance short-term profits against long-term sustainability. Yet the fundamental contradiction of his position, trying to run a business that relies on secrecy and violence in an era of sophisticated law enforcement and declining social tolerance for organized crime, ultimately proved unsolvable. By the series' end, Tony's empire was crumbling despite his substantial wealth. Informants had penetrated his organization, the FBI was closing in, his best earners were dead or imprisoned, and his family relationships were deteriorating. The money Tony made came at an enormous cost, not just to his victims, but to himself and his family. His panic attacks, depression, and psychological deterioration were the price of his business success. The alienation from his children, the hollow relationships, and the constant paranoia were what his millions bought him. In the end, Tony Soprano was extraordinarily successful by criminal standards. He made tens of millions, lived a life of relative luxury, avoided prison for serious crimes, though his fate remained ambiguous, and maintained power for years. Yet measured against human happiness and well-being, his success was questionable. He had money, but not peace, power but not security, respect but not love. This analysis of Tony's earnings reveals not just the financial mechanics of organized crime, but the fundamental tragedy of his character. He was brilliant enough to make millions through criminal enterprise, but trapped in a life that prevented him from enjoying that success. He built a financial empire that was simultaneously enormously lucrative and ultimately unsustainable, reflecting the broader trajectory of American organized crime in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Tony Soprano made approximately $60 to $70 million over the course of The Sopranos, but what he truly earned, in terms of life satisfaction, family relationships, and personal peace, was far less than his bank account suggested.